yesterday's news.
Hello, welcome to Old News, the programme and podcast which looks at news stories of the day through the papers of yesterday. Well, this week, Manx itself, you might have seen a little news story about some loan words from the Manx language making it into the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. Words like taiveg, the loo in our household, or indeed something along the lines of coosh, which is like a meeting or a greeting, I think. You hear of the coosh over here being borrowed by the English language. Made me think, let's go back in the papers and look at Manx words, the Manx language, how it might have featured in the papers over the years. I take you to a fascinating piece in the Isle of Man Times of the 18th of September 1869, quite some time ago. Pinjean. I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced. That's how it's spelled. Pin and Jean, all one word. Might be Pinjean, but Pinjean or Pinjean. Do you know what it is? That's what the article writer is asking. I wonder, does every one of your readers know the meaning of the word Pinjean? I think it is a Manx word meaning curded milk. It is customary in the Isle of Man, the writer says, in the farmhouses for about 3 months in the year, if any strangers or acquaintances happen to call in the evening, to ask them to have some Pinjean. It's something I'm excessively fond of, with a little cream and sugar added. Milk with cream and sugar. That's the spirit. But, it goes on, there is good and bad in Pinjean as well as in everything else. I've been to several places this year and I can testify to this fact. I've got it good, bad and indifferent. I have noticed particularly that if the old woman made it, it would only be middling. But if the young one made it, especially if she hadn't a sweetheart and thought anything of a fellow, it would be done to a T. Not too sure what that was. One evening in particular, I happened to be at Lambfield Anniversary, where I became acquainted with a nice young lady, Miss C, living not quite 1,000 miles from Lambfield Chapel, who, it seems, knew I was rather partial to good Pinjean. I, of course, accompanied her home, and that evening, for the first time, I really had a treat. The young lady made it herself and sweetened it exactly to my taste. It was what one might call good Pinjean. I might mention where I got the bad and the indifferent Pinjean, but it would only be wasting time and paper. Certainly it is. Some people see a pint of new milk as big as a cheese and a halfpenny as big as a cartwheel. A wealthy farmer once told me he had amassed together his possessions merely by a strict adherence to one single maxim, which he never once violated or infringed in the course of 40 years, namely to consider a farthing as some part of a guinea, and a guinea as the 999th division of 1,000, and so on ad infinitum. Well, the article goes on at some length, but does at the end suggest, I can with confidence recommend a good cooling basin of Pinjean, which can be had in many of the farmhouses about Craig Willie's Hill and what is written then as Lambfield, but that must be Lambfell. And the writer is just called Memorabilia in 1869. Quite modern sounding language. I think I've heard of Pinjean, but if that is the correct pronunciation, but I stand to be corrected. I certainly haven't tried it, with or without added sugar and cream. The mind boggles. The Manx Sun, June the 28th, 1873. In correspondence, pronunciation of Manx words, to the editor of the Manx Sun. Sir, in a note on page 17 of the Manx Grammar published by the Manx Society, it is stated that the Manx spelling is based on phonography. That's phonography, not pornography. The words are written as they are pronounced. It is, however, necessary to know the sounds which the different letters are intended to represent before one can make a successful attempt at speaking or reading in the language, when the only means of acquiring such a power are those to be derived from books. And as the rules for pronunciation contained in the above grammar and in the preface to Craigeen's dictionary are incomplete, I wish, with your kind permission, to ask someone in your island for better information on the subject. I am chiefly at a loss to know how to pronounce double vowels, such as AA, etc., all the diphthongs and triphthongs, and to understand why the letter H should occur after such consonants as D, T, L, etc. It seems like carelessness to find Tríslallan on page 16 of the Manx grammar and 3 Stollen on page 18, although the cases are the same. My difficulties and consequently my wants are so many that I must refrain from enumerating them, but I would ask anyone who may be good enough to reply to my letter to take up either the grammar mentioned or any other Manx work, and noting the words as they occur, to select an example of each combination of letters to be found, and thus secure, without doubt, a full list of the orthopical difficulties which perplex outsiders. Of course, I will for this information in the belief that it will benefit other Celtic students besides myself, and trust that my present query will meet a better fate than one which I before addressed to you, pointing out to you what I considered errors in the Manx grammar. Oh, I can see where they're coming from. Notably in the chapter on the declensions of nouns, my remarks being treated with silence by your readers. Oh dear, yours respectfully, etc., etc. W.R.D. Dated June the 23rd, 1873. You can't beat a good pedant, but he's got a point, or she's got a point, who knows. A very brief piece in the Alaban Examiner, Saturday, May the 16th, 1903, is just listed as, constantly, there is no Manx word at present applicable to parent. I'll leave it at that. There's nothing more other than that piece. If we go to the Examiner, Saturday, July the 24th, 1915, English, Manx, Gaelic etymologies. How the Manx word brod came to signify a sting, by Henri M. Léon, M.A., Ph.D., F.S.P. Again, a lengthy piece. But it starts out, in our previous articles, we have seen that the Manx word brod, signifying a sting, a stab, a wound, an incision or a gash, had its counterpart not only in other Celtic languages, but also in many Aryan tongues. We have even found it present in languages so vastly different as Hebrew, Semitic, and Japanese. With these facts before us, the question we should now set ourselves to answer is how and why such a combination of letters came in so many various languages to signify something which caused pain, inflicted a wound, or was of a penetrating nature. In order to give a satisfactory reply to this extremely important query, absolutely, we must get back to very primitive times. Let us endeavour to suppose the existence of a period when the human family possessed no words. Such a supposition is by no means an improbable one. On the contrary, all the evidence so far as philological research goes tends to show that there was a time in the history of man before any words were invented or known. Just as man has evolved from primitive chippings off stone utensils and weapons of more complete form and better material, so by parity of reasoning may we believe he has evolved language. Well, I think that's probably true, isn't it? And it goes on to say, the origin of human speech. At the period when human beings possessed no words, it's clear that men could have no other method of communicating to others of their species that what they felt or desired, save by the cries of passion, more or less seconded by such gestures and motions as were further expressive of such feeling. Hence, we find among primitive nations many words which are monosyllables, and in numerous instances are either simple ejaculations or modifications thereof. Practically all the words known as interjections range themselves under this category. Dr. Hugh Blair, 1718 to 1800, well expresses this fact in one of his lectures when he says, these exclamations, which by grammarians are called interjections uttered in strong and impassioned manner, were beyond doubt the first elements of beginnings of speech. And he goes on to think about things like "oh." The exclamation "oh" could well have been one of the first words used and is common or commonish among various different languages. A fascinating long article. But do you know the word brod? I must admit I don't know that as a sting, but I might start using it. You got a brod there? You had brod on your leg. Who knows? The Examiner, Friday, December the 20th, 1935, they write and say, shop hours, socialism and communism, pronouncing Manx words 25 years ago. And this seems to be from possibly, I don't know, it's written by a Philip Kane from Bayview Road in Port Erin, but without an E, so I'm not too sure whether it's one of my Kanes or not. To the editor of the Examiner, Sir, The Clunyic, held in St George's Hall, Douglas, showed there is a keen interest taken in everything Manx. Interesting, Clunyic spelt, I thought it had an H, but that's without. The readings, which were attempted by English tongues and English alphabet, revealed the struggle with what is almost an impossibility. The late Mr. John Kelly, the author of the Manx Dictionary, wrote, "As there is no Manx pronouncing dictionary, the words can be pronounced by natives of the Isle of Man only, and as there are so few people who can pronounce the language properly, I think the legislature should see that a Manx pronouncing dictionary is printed. I suggest the easiest way would be to have a few well-spoken Manx people compile the dictionary, allotting to one person all the words beginning with A and B to another, C and D, and so on. Yours, etc., Philip Kane." A labour of love, I think. What about the word Tholtons in the Isle of Man Times, Saturday, June the 20th, 1936? Tholton is a Manx word signifying a ruined dwelling, we read. Hundreds of such ruins are visible from the high roads of the Isle of Man, and whether one likes or indeed dislikes them is perhaps a matter of individual taste. Some folks seeing them are moved to a pleasing melancholy, to a twinge of the distress that humanises the soul. The national poetess Cushig says, "Lone little Tholton left by the wayside, where have they wandered that loved thee of old? Where are the children that played by the fireside? Poor little Chullock, forlorn and cold." And that's another word, I think, which has made it into the OED, Chullock, which is a fireplace. There is sometimes picturesqueness in desolation, the article goes on, but there are people who do not wish to be reminded of what is sad, people to whom these crumbling walls and weed-covered floors seem flatly ugly and disreputable. Cushig herself praised for the little ruined dwelling the kindness of oblivion, and that she quotes again from Cushig, "Hasten the day when those desolate gables, holding their secret of failure and dearth, gently shall sink to their grave by the wayside, hidden at last in the warm, kind earth." And the article writer goes on, "The trouble is that ruins do not sink into the earth naturally, but stay in all their dilapidation till the hand of man levels them away. The view of Mr. Crellin, the chairman of the local government board, and of some other members of the Tynwald Court, is that the Tholtons should be pulled down. Mr. Crellin doubts whether anyone has power to order it to be done." Well, I'm very glad that they weren't done. But the public authority, goes on later on, ought to have power not only to destroy but to preserve. Quite right. The old-fashioned Manx cottage intact is a charming thing. It may not suit the modes of living of the present generation. Very often the cottage has been abandoned because the family that lived in it has been scattered far and wide. But it represents the old life. It speaks of days when independent, sturdy, industrious, steady, and yet not joyless Manx people maintained themselves and did their duty to their generation, and did not hesitate when the call came to go forth to replenish and subdue the earth. Well, some romantic writing on Tholtons. I'm very glad they aren't or weren't all pulled down, because it is indeed a joy to see them. And to this day, you can see many dotted around the Isle of Man. There are several books on them, of course, by Ray Kelly, I think. And you go in some and you do get exactly what it's talking about there, a sense of the family or families who might have lived out their lives back 100 years, perhaps 150 years, maybe more. And finally, in the Isle of Man Times, Saturday, June the 24th, 1944. Short and sweet again. A new ship somewhere in the British Isles recently has been christened Early, which is a Manx word meaning eagle. I assume I've pronounced it correctly. It could be earlier, but I think it's early. This is a nice compliment for the naval authorities to pay to this island. Well, there you are, 1944. They were already borrowing words from the Manx language, as indeed the OED now lists rather happily, and many more, we hope, might enter common usage as Manx sees its resurgence in interest once again. It's old news, whichever way you look at it. Until next week, cheerio.
You're gonna be yesterday's news.